as you see fit. Um, and we also mostly record so people have this information on our website where you can also see it after the workshop. Okay, welcome everyone. Okay, we can get started. So first with our agenda, our objectives or goals. We have the introductions. I'll do a quick history of Chinook Fund, just so you have an idea of where Chinook Fund fits into the philanthropy scape of Colorado specifically. And then I'll review where our grant making process starts with the Giving Project, which is a program I'll go into, and the main thing that funds our grant making dollars. So you'll get to hear a little bit about that. Then we have our grant making criteria, what we do and do not fund. We'll go a little bit over how we at Chinook Fund define community organizing, since that's one of our priorities. And then we will walk through the actual portal on the application website. And then we'll have some quick space at the end for questions and also additional contact information in general, as well as a reminder of a deadline. Also, if you have questions throughout the workshop, you're welcome to put them in the chat and then we'll come back to them as we go through it. Or we'll let you know if it's coming up later on the slides or if there's space for questions towards the end. A quick history of Chinook. So many foundations actually got started around this time, which was the 60s, 70s, around the great tax reforms situation that the US government put nationally. So this were incentives for people with money to move their wealth to charity so they would not have to pay as much taxes, essentially. And there were many debates going on around then. Chinook did not start just because of that, actually. We started more closer to the 80s when people involved in the civil rights movements decided to come together, bring their money together as community, and take more of the community approach to philanthropy. So there was no like one single donor. We are a public community foundation, which means our funds come from our public or our community, and then they also get distributed back to community through a community process. There's different types of community foundations, and you probably know some of them in Denver or Colorado, and nationally, but they're typically geographically located. So they're Denver based. There's specific areas or states that they're based on, but mainly they function to hopefully keep the money in the community rather than one wealthy person donating to a fund. And we're part of a national network. So you'll see more when we go over the Giving Project that we're part of other organizations across the US. Our main mission is the Chinook Fund seeks community-led systemic change by mobilizing resources for and trusting in grassroots social justice organizations across Colorado. So the main difference here is that we're the only foundation in Colorado that funds specifically community-led community organizing. There's not many organizations that focus community-led in general, but specifically also addressing the grassroots social part of it, which is funding the smaller organizations, oftentimes kind of in the beginning stages. But you'll see when we go over our grantees, some of them have been working for 10 years and have intentionally been stayed small in terms of their annual budgets, but they have a big impact in their communities as community members or community groups. In some groups, some ideas, they're just coming about. They're brand new, but they have their neighborhood or they have their schools. They have some form of community seed already in place, but they're still new to applying to any grants. So we kind of cover both of those groups. Um, I mentioned we receive our money from the public or donors from a community. but they're specifically given to the Giving Project. So, Giving Project is a group of volunteers who fundraise actually for us, and then they decide where the funding goes to. So, they're the ones who are going to be reviewing your applications if you decide to apply. They're the ones who will be doing site visits if they decide a site visit makes sense for your organizations. And they come from all types of backgrounds. So people who are deep in philanthropy have connections to people with money, or they're people in your communities, people who from some of our grantees who want to join to learn more about fundraising with the supportive community and also connect themselves to that community of fundraisers. We definitely do more a donor community organizing focus where we ask people to empower themselves to ask for funds and practice their own fundraising skills with their community, even if they think that community may not have funds to begin with, or to celebrate that there's a lot of support already and mutual aid and connections in community, and people are oftentimes willing to give, especially to causes important to them. But this is a 6 month process. This is why the application takes a while. So from the time community groups apply um, to when they hear back final decisions is around a 6 month difference. And we're still recruiting for this cohort coming out with the spring 2026. So if you know people who would be interested in learning more about fundraising through a donor organizing lens while granting money to organizations, this is a good program that you could share with them. Okay, let's get started on the timeline. So the application deadline will be February 16th. The screening meetings, these are where the GP, the Giving Project members will be reading the applications, is from March through April. And then there's a decision, depending on how many applications, there's a decision that happens then of who moves forward to the site visits and who doesn't. So if you move forward into the site visit, you'll hear back from the Giving Project members themselves around May or June. And then final decisions happen around mid-June with final notifications by the end of June. Mm, okay. And then we have funding guidelines. So these are kind of our requirements. So for a grantee or an organization to receive funding, they have to meet our criteria, which we also call funding guidelines. The main thing is that you have to be based in Colorado. We don't fund any groups that are based outside of Colorado unless they're a regional indigenous group or an organization that works with a regional indigenous group and they overlap boundaries into or into present day Colorado. So there is that caveat there. But otherwise, if you're an organization based in California or your leadership is based in California and you work somewhat in Colorado, it's very unlikely that you will be eligible for our grant. We also only support organizations that are based or that have a budget of $350,000 or less. So if your organization has $1 million in their annual budgets, that would automatically disqualify you. And that also means most of our grantees are very small, oftentimes volunteer-led or 2, 3, 4 staff max. But we don't look at how big the organization is in that way. We look at the budget and then where they're based. Also, if you've applied to the recent cycle in the fall 2025 and you either were declined or you received the grant, then you must wait until the next one, until fall 2026 to qualify again. And then we also have a list of things we definitely do not fund. Um, we don't give funds directly to individuals, but that includes direct services to individuals. So if there's an organization that provides food to individuals and that's their main mission, um, then it's not as tough or it's not going to be as competitive in our review cycle as other applicants. So that also means we don't provide funding to groups that provide funding to other individuals themselves, unless there's some caveats that could happen if there is other groups. There are community-led groups that provide fundraise for their community-led efforts. Um, but most times we won't fund an organization if all they do is give scholarships or they give money to other people. Oftentimes that would be a disqualifier. That includes other foundations or pass-through funding to other groups. So we're not going to fund another project where their members decide where the money goes to other organizations after they get funded. We already said we don't give funding to groups with budgets over $350,000 annually. And then we don't fund individuals themselves or scholarships or groups controlled by one individual. You'll see in the application, we're going to ask for bios, your history, who's in your community. And that's because because we will ask for all of that because we don't want to fund just one individual group organization because oftentimes those are not community-led efforts. Mm. We also do not fund profit-making companies or organizations, with the exception of worker-owned cooperatives. So that is something we will go over later on. And then, like I said, we won't be funding organizations where their leadership or their work is based outside of Colorado. Again, with exceptions for regional indigenous groups. And then we also will not fund groups that attempt to influence the election of individuals for public office. Are there any questions so far? No questions so far. Um, oh, there is a question. Maybe. Is it Dessa asking if mutual aid is part of the organization but not its sole purpose, is that disqualifying? It would mutual aid would not disqualify you on its own. And we'll go over the other criteria, but if the only thing you do is give funds to individuals, then it could disqualify you, but not on its own. Thank you. Mm. Okay. So I will review some application details just because a lot of our applicants need a little extra reminder or support as they go through our application. It is a pretty extensive application process on that end. But quick reminders, we fund 501c3 organizations or groups with a fiscal sponsor or co-ops. So we define a worker-owned cooperative as simply a business owned and managed by its workers or its employees. Your work or your application would still need to be a form of charity work as defined with the 501c3 status or with the community. It must have some form of community impact. Otherwise, you can apply as a fiscally sponsored group. We offer two options. So there's the general operating and the project support. We encourage applicants to just apply for the general operating category unless your project has a stronger or match to our application. So if your project aligns better with our criteria, the leadership of that project reflects more the community it affects. There's just more work impact in general happening with one project over the whole organization, then we would maybe recommend you apply for project support. Otherwise, just apply for the general operating option. We have two grants. A startup grant is you're just applying for a $4,000 grant, and established means you're applying for a $10,000 grant. There's not, or the main difference besides the amounts is that groups that are newer tend to apply, and we encourage groups that are newer to apply for the startup grant. In groups that have already some form of big community impact or they've already been doing this work for longer than 3 to 4 years, then we encourage them usually to apply for $10,000, but they're not attached to anything else. So you get to decide which grant makes more sense for you based on what you define as your need and also your competitiveness in terms of your application. Oh, but groups, $10,000 groups tend to be a little more competitive towards the end. But you're being evaluated all at the same time. There's no separate docket for $4,000 grants from $10,000 grants. Everyone's reading your application together. So startups and established grants are being read at the same time. So they're being evaluated in the same way. I think it's a question. So what if we have been doing the work for 4 years, but under a different entity? So you can speak about the history of the group. Even if you were in a different organization, the leadership of your project that you are applying for, you can speak about it in the history part of the application. And yeah, you can apply to startup or establish. You cannot submit two applications. You can only submit one at a time. Okay. There's a question about non-fiscally sponsored or 501(c)(3) tribal program departments, divisions under federally recognized tribes in the. Oh, that's a good question. I think so. You're asking if you are a federally recognized tribe, but you're not a 501(c)(3). Is that the question, Sunaba? Oh, just curious. I think we would still want to see if you fit other criteria. Um, if there's a coalition that could count as a group. But typically, there would have to be some form of either fiscal sponsor or partner that could be a fiscal sponsor after a grant is potentially funded. So we would still want some form of 501(c)(3) partnership. And we would be working with you if we think you're still a good match for an application, but that's the only challenge or the only barrier to receiving funds. But typically, we would require a fiscal sponsor or be a worker-owned cooperative. Okay, we can go to documents. So we always request a fiscal sponsor agreement if you have a fiscal sponsor. We will request leadership bios, a diversity chart as well, and we'll go into what those look like. And we also require a financial form. We have our own form as part of the application. Or you have the option to submit your own materials. So we'll go over those on financials. Um, but we request you submit a balance sheet, income statement, or an approved budget, or you can fill up our financials forms, which will ask you for some of the things that you would find in the other financial documents. Okay, quick overview. Well, maybe not quick, but overview of our guidelines slash criteria. So all successful applicants must demonstrate constituent leadership, community-wide and lasting effect, since these are our main focus of Chinook Fund. Okay, so our first one being constituent-led, we prioritize and we accept work that is led by people most impacted by the injustice. So that's because we believe the people most affected have the vision and solutions for their own liberation, since they face the most impact. So the questions in the application will be asking things like, who is the most impacted people in your work? And what injustice are they fighting or are they facing? And how do you identify and develop new leaders? So how are they, the people most impacted, engaging other people most impacted in their communities? So an example question would be for youth organizing. If you are applying as a youth organizing group, then we expect you to share how are youth voices being incorporated into leadership. Is there a youth advisory board or some other decision-making body? And that's only if you're a youth-focused organization. But those are good questions to consider for any work.
Hey, Alma. We have a question in the chat that I think was from the last section. That says, I am in a
Oh,
leadership
yeah.
for two different community groups with the same fiscal sponsor. Can I apply for both groups?
Mm. If there are separate groups themselves and they do separate work and they have other leadership that reflects that work that they're separately doing, then yes. So similar to our definitions when we go through is the community leadership, the lasting effect, the constituent part of it should be different enough that there's no one individual making decisions for both. That I think that's what we would be asking you or asking ourselves. The Giving Project members will be asking themselves as they're reading the applications if they seem to be doing the same thing. But I guess the short answer is yes. Um, People would just have more questions about how that works. Are there other questions or follow-ups? Okay. Now, let me get some water. Okay. So next on the second criteria is intersectionality. Work reflects all members or as many members of your constituency or community as possible. So particularly people who would not otherwise have access to power or have access to resources. So that's usually people who face multiple forms of oppression. How are they represented in your organization or how are they part of the leadership? So the questions that we would go over in the application is how does your organization define diversity within your constituency? And how do you ensure that everyone or as everyone as possible is represented in your organization, especially those with less privilege in your community? We also look at the diversity chart. So we do ask as comfortable as you can be if you're able to share the background of your leadership, especially. so that we know, are they youth? Are they, I guess it depends on your issue area. So are you working with workers? Are they workers? Are you working with teachers? Are they actually teachers in your leadership? In their backgrounds related to their challenges. And then we have lasting effect, which we define as work that is making meaningful change for the community as a whole and for a future generation, at least. This is mainly because we don't want or we don't see as a priority to help someone now, and it's just for 1 month or it's just for one person. We want it to see the impact that's happening beyond one individual, beyond one or two people in the community. So that could be in the future generations, or that could be both present or future generations across a larger community. So questions I would get at this are what socioeconomic, political, or cultural institutions or systems will you work to change in order to fight the injustice? What actions will come out of your work? What will be different in your community or society because of your work? And we like people to think, imagine 15 years out, but it doesn't need to be 15 years. It could be next year. How will your community look different through the course of this grant, at least, which is literally 1 year? Questions on that, if there's any questions. Okay, we'll go. So, in summary, all successful applicants must be based in communities facing injustice, have some form of leadership or decision-making power unit that is led by and accountable to the people impacted by the issue. They have to be willing to engage in dismantling privilege and oppression within their communities or organizations. And that's because if you're engaging people who are most impacted by an issue, that means you are also fighting the institutions that would otherwise not allow them to be in the position of power. And you're demonstrating, or you're able to demonstrate that your work will lead to permanent progressive change in your community. We also have funding priorities, which are not requirements. So our grantees or sometimes many of our applicants fit our priorities well, but they may not fit our criteria, in which case you would still not be as a competitive of an application as you could be if you were meeting all our criteria first. Since those are the requirements, the priorities are important to us and are things that Chinook Fund wants to invest in, but they're not a requirement. So those would be rural organizations, community organizing groups, Black-led organizations, or Native-led organizations. So funding priorities could be you're a rural organization, and to us, that would mean that you're a group that is based outside of the Front Range, which means you're a group that is not in Denver, Boulder, Colorado Springs, or Fort Collins. So anywhere outside of these cities, we would consider your group to be a rural organization, and you could receive special consideration because of that. And that's because rural groups oftentimes don't get priority in community foundations. You may also be a community organizing group. So that is the process, or we define it as the process of bringing affected people together to use their collective power to win improvements in their community and change the power structure to advance social justice. So again, that's another priority of Chinook. but not necessarily a requirement. Um, we also prioritize Black-led and Indigenous-led organizations, and that's because we want to uplift the efforts around Black liberation. So we want to prioritize, like I said, Black-led, anti-oppression efforts, and that could be a wide range of things from reparations to invest or divest, economic justice, gaining community control or political influence. Um, and this is in terms of community organizing, not elections. And then we also want to prioritize indigenous sovereignty. So we want to support indigenous-led efforts such as self-determination, indigenous rights, cultural and language revitalization, preserving identity and worldviews, and then environmental justice could also be part of that. Um, are there any questions so far? Okay. For community organizing, Giving project will be reading the applications, looking for a base of support. So is there a grassroots base of support? Is there a strategic direction driven by that base? Are there clear demands for policy or system change? Have they identified a power map or some form of plan where they see who are the people making power or making decisions because they have power? And how can we reach those people to address that? Is there a leadership ladder? So are people making more leaders, or is it just one group of five people and they're doing all the work and they're not building other leaders in their community to do parts of the work as well? And we especially differentiate community organizing different than direct services, different than education and advocacy, and different than empowerment on their own. There could be layers. So you could be doing community organizing and direct services, or you could be doing community organizing and empowerment. But we at Chinook would separate those or would try to see which area of your work best fits our application. So direct services include things like supplying basic services to people who need them. So oftentimes that means providing food, healthcare, shelter, transportation. And this is very important to our communities, especially right now, but it's not a priority of Chinook Fund. So if your group's main mission is only to provide things like pregnancy tests or healthcare to specific communities, that on its own would not be a priority, and your application would probably not make it farther into the process. Is there a question? Oh, mhm. So Bruno is asking if you're building a community that has not yet begun the work. Sounds? Would you still be able to apply? Yeah, so we get a lot of startups that are in beginning stages. So if you're already in a collective of a community doing or setting the ground for community organizing that will happen, that could still be an application. Um, you would still need to share a lot of your plan to open an effort. Yeah, so there's many applicants who apply, and there are three neighbors who have a really good idea, and they already have connections to the neighborhood, for instance. but they never applied to a grant. They haven't been able to do the work in their communities because they're volunteers and they just have this great idea. So we do receive applications like that. You are still applying um, with, or your application is still being read with organizations that have been doing the work for at least 1 year. So I think that's the only thing to consider. But yes, we welcome applications from startups who are setting up their work and also organizations that have been doing this for many years, but they've stayed small. Okay, kind of
Were
did.
you able to catch the question right before that? My headphones went out for a moment. I'm sorry.
Oh, how do
It
groups
says, how do
demonstrate?
groups demonstrate base of support?
Yes, I did not see that. One second. So we will ask you who is in your community and how is your community supporting you? That is a question in the application. So that is how you'll be able to share who is in your community. And oftentimes people get asked, how do you fundraise or how are you funding your work? We adjusted that question to also include if your community is engaging in some other way to help you. It doesn't need to be just that they're donating money to your fund or to your work, but that they are part of your base or that they show up to your meetings or that they spread the word about your program or that they volunteer at your kitchen if you have one. Um, that's how we basal support is also very broad in that way. It's who is the community that you're engaging with in your work, and are they showing up? Okay, I'll keep going with the other definitions that are not a priority for Chinook, but we want people to know. Okay, so education and advocacy on its own are also not a priority. So if your work is engaging specifically around a policy, but it's led by lawmakers or it's led by lawyers and lobbyists, if that's the main thing that you speak about on your application, then you would also not move, or you would not be considered that you're meeting a priority. Because if you're moving legislation or policy on behalf of people, then it's oftentimes not inclusive of the people most impacted. And so you would have to communicate where you're actually constituent led, community wide, and lasting effect could be the policy, but you're still we would have questions about the rest of your application if your main focus is only education and advocacy. So, for instance, we have an example of the Act for Reproductive Rights could be a state affiliated or a state affiliate of a national organization dedicated to accessible abortion. So they combat laws and lobbies around this issue, or they address this issue specifically in policy, but they don't have any leadership in community, or they don't talk to the people who don't have access to any healthcare to begin with, or they don't care to engage other voices, but they do engage and they do make a lot of important work. Again, this is important work for our communities, but it's just not a priority for Chinook in terms of the rest of our criteria. Mm. Okay, there's another question. So there's a question asking community organizing the education space where we work to bridge the skill gap in STEAM area through volunteer-led programs in Title I school. Does this qualify? Um, I would not be able to tell you if you would um, make it into the separate rounds of evaluation, but if you are doing community organizing how we define it, or if you think you fit that definition and you meet our eligibility, so are you based in Colorado and you're a small organization, then you could apply. But it would be hard for me to just identify just based on your project. There's nothing that would disqualify you. I just don't know how far in the application process you would go without learning a little bit more about your specific project. Um, but just because, yeah, but if you're bridging the skill gap in STEAM on its own would not disqualify you. If you think community organizing or you would fit our criteria for community organizing, then you would also fit one of our priorities that would help your application as well. But I wouldn't be able to say that you're disqualified or not disqualified. Okay. The last part that we differentiate from community organizing or that it's just not a priority for Chinook is empowerment. So there's many organizations again doing the amazing work of empowering communities that would not otherwise be empowered. So they're probably providing programs that focus on supporting positive identity development and self-esteem amongst marginalized groups. And again, this is a very important work. This is on its own, it's not a priority for Chinook Fund. So, for instance, a youth program put up by Healthy You, Healthy Us at a middle school or a high school where students are paired with program graduates as mentors. And this program runs an after school program for community service projects with the goal of empowering youth to make informed decisions. So this mission on its own would not be a priority for Chinook Fund. It doesn't mean that you don't meet other criteria, or I wouldn't be able to tell right now if it meets the other criteria like community-led, community-wide, or lasting effect. But in terms of our priorities, it would not be a priority for Chinook Fund to support this type of project on its own. So, quick reminder of community organizing framework. So, the process of bringing affected people together to use their collective power to win improvements in their community and change the power structure to advance social justice. Oh, wait. And a quick reminder too is that community organizing tends to change something around this institution they're organizing around. So oftentimes, if there's a youth and teacher uh, uh, group, or there's like a group of parents who are organizing, just by them organizing doesn't mean they could change the structure of the school to include them more. But if they are organizing for power, then they are asking the school probably to include parent decisions more. So that would automatically change the school, or in time, that could change the structure of the school itself. So individuals coming together for the collective power around a specific issue could alter the structure of the institution being the school. That doesn't have to always be the case, but in community organizing, that is often one of the goals. So a community organizing framework could be this example. It doesn't mean that they would get funded for sure, but it includes some more of the strategies that we would be looking for in the application. So we would be looking at constituent-led. So this one seems to include uh, women of color-led organizing in rural Colorado. So that's already a group of people that are not often considered for funding across the state. They seem to amplify the voices of those most often unheard of, especially people who don't have access to healthcare like contraception or abortion. And they might be working with neighbors. They might be working with other people in the community in partnership with other bigger organizations that would be also targeting policy or addressing other access areas. Okay. Another example of community organizing that is not considered traditional community organizing, but we also see it as a priority at Chinook Fund is culture organizing. So we define that as the process of integrating arts and culture into organizing strategies. It is also about organizing for a particular tradition, cultural identity, community of place, or worldview. So one of our former grantees was the Denver Black Queer Collective, which aimed to provide a protective, supportive, and uplifting space for queer Black people in Colorado community. And they believe in collective joy, healing, and safety, queer resistance, and effective activism. So this is another area that we would place under community organizing as a less traditional form of organizing. And related to that would be healing justice. So, how oppressed communities holistically respond to and intervene on generational trauma and violence, and how they innovate collective practices that can impact and transform the consequences of oppression on their bodies, hearts, and minds. So, we also define healing justice as a priority on their community organizing. So here we have an example of Indigenous Will Brighty program in Cortez, Colorado. And they provide a space for those in substance abuse recovery or seeking recovery with compassion, cultural identity, and utilizing the Will Brighty model. So our stronger applications demonstrate how they work with a long-term vision that is clearly linked to culture current milestones. They have achieved success or have a very strong plan, or their individuals have history of having positively impacted the community. So even if you are in the startup stage of your work, um, your leadership might have that experience elsewhere, or they might bring in some of the community organizing, or as a collective, they bring the wisdom to the work. Then you're also welcome to share that in your application. Um, and then you see yourselves as part of a larger movement of social justice. You may also offer alternatives to existing institutions and systems that perpetuate injustice. And you might be taking risks by doing work that is marginalized or that is emerging. Okay, and you're welcome to check out our grantees on our website. That may give you an idea of the type of work we fund. We don't have a specific issue area, so we fund all types of work, anything from racial justice to general community organizing to housing justice, um, anti-violence, anti-oppression, work around arts, culture, media. There's no like specific area that we would focus on. And it changes also with each cohort of applications what the main issues highlighted are. So, mm. Okay. Any questions on criteria or priorities so far before I go into the application portal on our website? Okay. So might take me a quick minute. Um, while I stop sharing. Hmm. Okay. Are people able to see our Chinook Fund website on my screen? Awesome. So this is our website. One second. When you first go in, it will look like this. And then you can select grants, uh, how to apply. And here, I do recommend you take a look at it, especially these sections, especially the how to apply, because we have resources here for people. So first, you can access the grant portal, which we'll do in a second. You can see the grant application questions in advance, so you don't have to make an account to begin looking at the application. This one will give you all the questions that you could come across. Some of them may not be relevant to you. So the fiscal sponsor question, if you select that you don't have a fiscal sponsor, then we're not going to ask you additional things regarding that. But it's a good resource if you want to take a look at the questions. There, oh, oops. There's previous grant workshop recordings, so very similar to this one. You can also download the applicant tutorial PDF. So that one will walk you through setting up the account in the first place. Um, there's that. First, we'll start with the portal. So when you first go into it, it should look like this. Actually, when you first make an account, that's not going to walk you through the right place. One second. It will look like this when you don't have an account. You will create new account unless your organization already has an account with us. Maybe previous leadership or you've received grants in the past, then you definitely have an account with us. And if you don't know your login, then definitely let us know. So we're able to get you in. But this is what it will look like on your end when you try to make a new account. So we'll ask you, oh, you have to fill up all this information before you move to these questions, which we won't do yet. Oh, I'm going to proxy in. So give me one second. Mm, sorry, I have to log back in to my actual account to do this. Okay. Share my screen again, quick. Okay. So after you have made your account, you've put in your information, set up your username, it will look like this. Actually, it will give you the eligibility question, which we'll go over in a second. But just remember that even if it looks empty like this, you should always look for the apply button next to the home button. And that's where this one, I already took the eligibility quiz. I cheated. So you don't see the actual eligibility quiz, but I'll show it to you in a second. But this is what that looks like after you pass it. So that means you're Colorado based and you are your budget's under 350K annually. So you pass your eligibility quiz, it will say eligible. You can now click on the application. So it will take you here. You're welcome to read. It has everything I share in this presentation so far. And you click apply. So this is what it would look like. You have space to write your mission statement. Your organization was funded in what year. Um, we will ask you, do you have a fiscal sponsor or are a 501(c)(3)? If you're applying as a worker-owned cooperative, then you need to let us know ahead of time so we can get you in labeled correctly on our end. Where did you hear about Chinook? So it's going to have all these types of questions. These are the funding questions, the narrative questions, the milestones. We will ask about financials, which we will cover in a second. Things to keep in mind here. You can read the application in other languages as Google allows us. So we have this feature on our website, and I guess I would do, I'm trying to find Spanish. So you could click here, and Google Translate will translate the questions to Spanish or to whichever language you have. So that's not 100% accurate, but it has helped many of our applicants go through the application. And always, if you have any questions, we can try to help you on our end or get interpretation to help us or help you fill out the application. Our giving project members are only able to read it in Spanish or English, but we're working with our translation feature on Google Translate as well on our end. That's what the application site looks like. Okay, I'll come back to our slides. Okay. And it looks like our finance manager is online, but I still need to cover the stuff I skipped. Okay, we did go over creating your account, so that's what our website looks like. Selecting the language through Google Translate if you need to. The eligibility quiz. Okay, I think we went over that. My email is grants@chinookfund.org, and it should be available on our portal as well as you move through the application. If there's any questions, but I'll pass it to Trina to walk us through our financials.
Thanks, Alma. Hello, everyone. So I'm the Finance and Operations Manager for Chinook Fund, and I'm just going to give you a little overview of the financial section. And I know since some of you I know financials are everybody's favorite part of any application. And we're trying to make it as easy as possible for you. So um, anyway, we'll just dive in. So you have two options as far as submitting your financial information. Um, you can use our financial form, which is what we highly recommend because it only requires a handful of fields to be filled in. We don't ask you for a lot of information, but if you prefer, if you already have the financial statements and reports that we require, if you already have those prepared and you just want to submit those, just attach those to your application, you are welcome to do that. Um, yeah, next slide. So first, I just want to be clear that everybody understands what we mean by fiscal year. So that is a 12-month accounting period that any organization uses for their financial or their tax reporting purposes. Fiscal year is also known as your financial year. So most organizations use a calendar year, so starts in January, ends in December. If that's the case for you, then your last completed fiscal year would be 2025. Some organizations, such as Chinook Fund, follow a different financial or fiscal year. We are based on a July 1 through June 30 fiscal year. So our year ends in June 30th, on June 30th of each year. So just making sure everybody understands what we mean in the application by fiscal year. All right, next slide. So this is our financial form. And as I said, we highly recommend that you use this. And excuse me, if you are, well, first off, hold on, I got to make the screen a little bit bigger for my aging eyes. Let's see here. Okay. So the top part of the form is what you're seeing here. And this is asking for your prior completed fiscal year information on the left-hand column. And then on the right-hand column is the current fiscal year. So if you are on a calendar fiscal year and you just completed your year on December 31st, in that first column, excuse me, the start date for prior fiscal year will be January 1, 2025. Just put my glasses on. Uh, and then we want your total income, so all the revenue that you brought in 2025. Total expenses, so that's everything that you spent in 2025. And then your net income or loss if it's negative, and that's not necessarily going to knock you out of contention. um, so that your net income or net loss is your total income minus total expenses. That's what goes in that bottom box. And then over on the right-hand side, your current fiscal year start date. So again, if you're on a calendar year, that will be January 1st, 2026. Your total income, that will be what you've budgeted for this current year. What do you expect to bring in for income this year? And then total expenses, what you've budgeted for your expenses this year. And then again, the difference, your net income or projected net loss for the year, which is your income minus your expenses. Excuse me. Next slide. And then oops. Oh, sorry. I just went through. I didn't really, I forgot that we had them broken down page by page. So I do want to say that for the prior fiscal year column, that first column that we were just looking at, if you are a brand new organization and you haven't completed a fiscal year yet, like you're just starting this year as your very first year, you can just fill in for prior fiscal year, since you don't have any information, just enter the same date as your current year. So January 1st, 2026, and then you can just enter zeros for the total income, expenses, and net income. And we'll understand that you don't have a prior year to report on. All right, next slide. Okay, and then this is the bottom section of the form. So you'll end, or the first box, we're asking for the ending date for your prior fiscal year. So again, if you're on calendar fiscal year, it will be 12/31/25. And then we want to know what total cash balance did you have in the bank as of that date? So total checking, savings, anything that you have in the bank, enter that amount in that second box. And then this is a little tricky because of the timing of this spring cycle application, but we want to see the most recent month end ending balance as well. So continuing with my calendar year example, if you entered in that second box your bank balance as of 12/31, then in the third box, the most recent month end, if you're completing this form this month, if your January is not yet over, it will be 12/31/25 again. And so you would enter the same amount in the fourth box. But if you're completing it, say in January and you've completed, I mean, sorry, in February, and you've completed the month of January, then you would enter January 31st, 2026, and your ending bank balance as of that date. So it just depends on when you're completing your application. But we just want to see what was your bank balance as of the end of your prior completed fiscal year, and then what's your bank balance, in the most recent month end. All right, next. If you do decide to complete or submit your own financial reports, these are the three reports that we need to receive. So we need to receive a balance sheet as of your last completed fiscal year end, which is also known as your statement of financial position. We also want your income statement for the last completed fiscal year, which is also known as a profit and loss or a statement of operations. And then we want the budget for your current fiscal year. So we want to see, again, what you had as of the end of your last fiscal year, and then what you're planning for this coming fiscal year. So those are your options. Next slide, please. So I just want to show you, because I know not everybody is familiar with the different financial statements. I just want to show you what we mean by each of those if you are submitting your own financial forms. So a balance sheet, it lists all of your assets, which is everything that you own, all of your liabilities, which is anything that you owe, and then your net assets or your equity, which is the difference between those two. And this is just an example of a balance sheet. So you might have like cash in the bank. You might have a grant or donations that have been, committed to you, but you haven't received them yet. So they're considered a receivable. You might have like computers that you've purchased. So those would all be included in your assets. And then, everybody has our monthly bills, your rent, your purchases, whatever that you haven't paid yet. Those are your accounts payable. You might have some accrued vacation time that you owe to your staff. The thing I want to note is that your total assets should equal your total liabilities plus your net assets. If those two amounts don't equal, then your balance sheet does not balance. So that's a balance sheet. And let's go to the next slide. And then an income statement, also again known as a profit and loss, should again be for your last completed fiscal year. And so the ending date of your income statement should match the date of your balance sheet. So if your fiscal year ended on December 31st, your income statement will cover January 1st through December 31st, and your balance sheet will be dated as of December 31st. So this, of course, it shows all of your income. You might have donations from individuals. You might have grants. You might have had income from special events or interest. Those are just some examples. And then at your expenses, you might have salaries, consultants, rent, etc. So you have your total income, your total expenses, and then the difference between the two, which would be your net income, which is also known as change in net assets. All right, next slide. And then the third report that we ask for if you're submitting your own forms is your budget for the current fiscal year. So it's your best realistic estimate of what funding you expect to receive and what you plan to spend it on. It does not necessarily have to balance. It doesn't have to come out to a zero at the bottom. Excuse me. But we just want to see like what are you expecting to receive um, in the coming year and or in the current year and what you expect to spend that on. Um, this example like breaks out the different expenses by program management and fundraising, but a budget, it can just be totals. It doesn't have to include all that detail, just showing that as an example. All right, next slide. Yep. Is that all for the financial then, Alma?
Yes, unless people have questions.
Yeah, I was just going to pause and see if anybody had any questions on what I just covered. And if you think of something as you're filling out your application or later in the workshop, I know Alma will share my email along with her own at the end. And I'm happy to answer any questions, help anybody out with figuring out their financial information. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Trina. Okay, back to general application. Um, we just have some final notes. So main one being there are branching questions throughout, so it will guide you with the require asterisk if we require branching response. It will give you character limits. So these are limits, they are not requirements. So you don't need, I think our typical limit's 2000 characters. You don't need to fill out the 2000 characters in each answer. That's just the limit. So please use what you need to provide the clear response, but you don't need to meet every single character limit on each question. And it will ask you to upload files in some questions. If you run into issues uploading them, as long as it's before the deadline, you are also welcome to make a note and email me the files, and then I'll add them back into your application. So just don't wait to try to upload an image that's not being accepted by the application right at the deadline, because then I probably won't be able to get to it before the deadline. But otherwise, definitely test that out before you submit the application. This is the summary of the things you will be asked on the application. We will ask you history, root causes, action and lasting effect, constituent leadership, community-wide questions. We will ask you who makes decisions and what is the process of making decisions and how your work connects to the creative movement. We used to ask about fundraising and evaluations. We changed those questions a little bit, so now we ask about community support as well. So you're welcome to write about your fundraising activities or just how your community supports you in however way you define or you see that happening. We also don't ask about how you evaluate your work anymore, more so how you integrate your community feedback. Oh, to zoom up a little bit, but this is our diversity chart. Organizations decide what is comfortable for them to share to Chinook Fund. But obviously, once we have this information, we are not going to share it to other people besides our giving project members who will be reading the applications. However, we also require them to not share this type of information outside. Typically, we only share any information once you receive funded, once you receive funding, if you receive funding, and if you grant us permission to share your mission and maybe obviously your website, your social media, but we will ask you before we share anything. And certainly we're not going to share your diversity chart. These are more of the questions. So this is an example. So we ask if age, if that's something you're willing to identify. For your lead, we definitely recommend you share who is in your leadership as part of your application. That just allows us to read your application and see which communities or yeah, which communities are impacted, which communities are leading your work. One second. You will submit via our grant portal, which I showed you, and it should be easy to locate on our website. But let me know if you have any questions or if you run into questions during the eligibility form. The final deadline is 11:59 p.m. on February 16th. So it's about 2 weeks, a little more. But before then, you're welcome to email me or Trina, and we can troubleshoot if you run into any issues on their website. Also, if you have questions around the questions on the application. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. Do I have anything else? Any final questions? We're ending a little earlier, but we wanted to give you all the time if there were any questions. Okay. Thank you all. Again, this is our information. Also, our office number and then the number that goes through my phone through work. So definitely feel free to reach out to us, and we look forward to potentially reading your application. Thank you all for your time. Okay. And we can stop the recording if we haven't already.